Welcome to the Smarter SMSF podcast, the show where we discuss the latest insights, ideas and strategies with self-managed super funds, all designed to help make smarter decisions and equip you to be at the top of your game. I'm your host, Aaron Dunn. Hey there, Aaron Dunn here, and thanks for joining me in this week's podcast. The topic of the day, of course, has been Labor's proposal, if elected, to reduce or remove the ability for a complying super fund from getting access to a cash refund from excess imputation credits. This is, of course, going to substantially impact, if elected, many self-managed super funds who have direct equity exposure within the Australian market and clearly benefit from what is currently the 30% franking credit that attaches itself to a dividend income that is paid. And for accumulation funds, certainly there's a 15% tax credit that is derived, but for our pension paying funds, and with SMSFs around 50% of all funds now paying some form of pension, this is certainly going to have an impact and goes right at the heart of Bill Shorten's proposal. Now, he does reference the fact, and we have seen the former Prime Minister, Paul Keating, come out and, I guess, confirm and really affirm this recommendation by the opposition leader, Bill Shorten, insofar that the intention of the franking credit refunds was to allow for the extinguishment of or reduction of tax, but to never fully refund the benefit of that franking credit. And we saw changes back in 2000 under the Howard Costello years, whereby that refundable credit therefore really didn't double tax the fund, but rather put the level of tax back on the taxpayer, insofar that if the fund was an exempt taxpayer, they got the full right and entitlement of that particular franking credit. So like I said, this is going to have a sizable impact on SMSFs more than any other. Within the APRA fund environment, whilst it may have an impact with the blend of both accumulation and pension members, ultimately we're not going to see it have as major impact as we are on small member type funds. So our SMSFs, small APRA funds, or even accounts where we have a highly aged population within that, again, where that Australian exposure to listed equities and dividends may mean that they're not going to get that refund. And what's important here is that the rate of return and the appeal to franking credits has really been the fact that we see many investors take a greater level of asset allocation inside the Australian equities market simply because they can leverage that additional rate of return, which could be anywhere between 0.5% or even a couple of percentage points each and every year because of the level of franking credits. And we've seen, sort of mum and dad indexes in the SMSF space are born over time because of that large exposure that they have into banking stocks and some of those real blue chip stocks that have high levels of fully franked income being paid to them. And that's really going to, if this unfolds as it may, from the 1st of July 2019, again, subject to the Labor Party being elected here, may then look at seeing some fairly sizable changes in the way in which we see the investment strategy of a fund constructed, because in many instances we may see investors start to move away from the exposure that they had in the Australian market and potentially look to move that into different markets. Now, not necessarily the fact that we would see it in property per se, in particular in a retiree sense, because cash flow and liquidity would certainly be something that we need to contemplate. But importantly, it may expand into money leaving Australian shores and moving into international shores. And therefore, we're losing the benefit of having money being invested in our country, which certainly dividend imputation provided an advantage for, and part of the reason why SMSFs, I guess, have invested heavily for some period of time. The other thing that I think is quite interesting, and we don't know the outcomes of this yet, but we've already seen on the 1st of July 2017 a policy adjustment that is impacting the level of franking credit refunds that will be occurring. For many of the funds that are impacted by this proposed measure, it has only been less than 12 months ago that these same funds have been impacted by a policy setting with the introduction of the transfer balance cap. Now, for many of those individuals, they have either made one of two choices. They have either, one, rolled that money back to the accumulation phase, and therefore the franking credit refund that they would be entitled to has effectively been halved. So a 15% earning rate against a 30% tax credit, they now are only deriving a 15% benefit. Or the other decision is that they've decided to take that money out of the superannuation environment, and therefore they may have a rate anywhere between zero right through to a higher marginal tax rate. More than likely, though, they would have capped themselves out at somewhere around what an equivalent rate would have been with that money inside the accumulation phase. But whatever the case, we now have a range of money that really was this part of a $6 billion omni-bill that went through less than, like I said, 12 months ago, that is going to have a direct impact again on many of those same people that have a high exposure into the Australian equities market. So therefore, whilst this is certainly not going to be a popular outcome here, we don't really have any measurement as yet in respect to the dollars that is going to amount to off the back of those changes from the 1st of July 2017. So we will watch this space with interest. When we think of things like share buybacks, quite clearly the type of things that Australian companies might look to offer would certainly dissipate, because there is going to be a whole range of taxpayers that would no longer be able to take advantage of that. We have seen charities and those sorts of institutions heavily weigh in on those share buybacks as an example. In more recent times, they have, of course, been carved out in this scenario, but it is going to substantially change the landscape and somewhat put SMSFs at a disadvantage because of the fact that they won't be able to fully utilise those franking credits. And it would beg the question then as to whether they would potentially leave those amounts in pension phase in their entirety if they don't need to draw down on the income that they need, and therefore they may have a combination of accumulation and pension money so that they absorb that franking credit in full if they decide to not make any changes to the investment strategy. But once again, I guess most importantly, it's leading to this outcome where governments can't seem to handle the fact that they continue to tinker with the system, the superannuation system, which only disenfranchises the community at large around the benefits of superannuation. Here we are, less than 12 months again, beyond some of the greatest reforms we've seen in a decade, and where we as advisors are talking to clients and saying, well, we can't see any way, shape or form that the government would look to be making any substantial changes again. And here we are having these discussions about potential further change. And this is the real frustrating bit, where consumers will, in losing that confidence, therefore means that the principles behind saving for retirement and self-funding for retirement certainly feel like they're being defeated. And it's that point that I think is the most frustrating bit, where governments clearly are on a process of spending, and the only way that they can facilitate keeping up with that spend rate is to look at really going to the heart of those that are self-funding for retirement and not having to rely on the government. And it's where these refunds no longer come about. Maybe, just maybe, it will mean that some of these people have to opt back in to the age pension requirements and so forth, where they may have been removed because of the fact that they would have a $10,000 or $15,000 refund each year. Some of those things over time, we may see them having to fall back in the system. So the question here is whether it is short-sighted in that respect. I guess most importantly, it'll be A, the devil in the detail, but B, more importantly, whether there's real strong pushback and whether the Labor Party would even get into government. So it is, like I said, only an announcement. It is a policy setting that the opposition leader, Bill Shorten, has set out today. It will be interesting to follow. Quite clearly, across the industry in general, it's been quite politically driven and disappointed, I guess, in the initial feedback and commentary that I've seen, and for just reason. So we need to wait and see what happens, and of course what would unfold as we move into an election later in the year. So if you do have any other questions that you'd like to ask around this proposed impact, you can get in contact with me at team@smartersmsf.com. We'll be feeding and taking on board any questions that you may have around this topic, but we need to wait and see. And like I said, we will just hold our breath and wait and see what unfolds in this space. So thanks for joining me in respect to today's podcast. If you do have any other questions, please feel free to reach out to me. Take care and bye for now. Thanks for joining me today on the Smarter SMSF podcast. That was a smart move. If you'd like to find out more about today's topic, you can add a comment either at our website, smartersmsf.com, via our Facebook page, or using our Twitter handle @SmarterSMSF.